Mark Williams was a 38-year-old mafia boss who once had everything. He controlled the city's most powerful crime syndicate, commanded armies of loyal soldiers, lived in a fortified estate that looked like a palace, and was married to a stunning woman from one of the wealthiest families in the country, Linda Hartford. From the outside, his life looked untouchable. But one night, everything changed. While driving home from a high-stakes meeting with rival families, gunfire erupted from all sides. The ambush was coordinated, brutal. Mark's armored SUV was riddled with bullets. His bodyguard died protecting him. Mark survived, but his body was shattered. When he woke up in a private hospital surrounded by armed guards, the doctor looked at him with grave concern and said the words that would change everything. "You're paralyzed from the waist down." Mark stared at the ceiling, unable to move his legs. In that moment, all his power, all his control, none of it mattered. At first, Linda rushed to his bedside, tears streaming down her face. "We'll get through this together," she whispered, gripping his hand. "I'm not going anywhere." But within days, something shifted. The woman who once looked at him with admiration now looked at him with something else: pity, disgust, maybe even contempt. She stopped meeting his eyes. Her visits became shorter. Her touch felt cold. And then came the night Mark would never forget. Standing in the doorway of his hospital room, Linda's voice was ice. "I didn't sign up to be married to a man who can't even stand up for himself."
Gentlemen, the
What
time has
Linda
come to make
didn't
our
know,
move.
what
We must
no
act
one knew
decisively and
except
without
Mark's
hesitation.
most trusted doctor, was that his spine had already begun to heal. Within 3 weeks, he'd be able to walk again. But Mark made a decision that night, one that would expose everyone around him. He would stay in that wheelchair. He would pretend to be broken. He would watch, and he would see exactly who his wife truly was when she thought he couldn't fight back. This is the story of a man who faked weakness to reveal the truth, and what he discovered didn't just break his heart, it destroyed everything he thought he knew about loyalty, love, and power. If you want to see how Mark's silent war unfolds, how betrayal cuts deeper than any bullet, and how a predator in a wheelchair becomes more dangerous than ever, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Let's begin. Mark Williams wasn't born into the mafia. He was born into poverty, in a neighborhood where survival meant learning to fight before you learned to read. His father was a dock worker who drank himself to death. His mother cleaned houses for families who treated her like she was invisible. Mark learned early that respect wasn't given, it was taken. By the time he was 16, he was running numbers for a local crew. By 20, he'd proven himself ruthless enough to lead his own operation. By 30, he'd eliminated every rival, consolidated power, and become the most feared man in the city. Mark Williams didn't ask for permission. He took what he wanted, protected what was his, and left no room for weakness. But even men like Mark wanted something more than fear. They wanted legitimacy. They wanted respect that didn't come from a gun. And that's where Linda Hartford came in. Linda was everything Mark wasn't. She came from old money, generations of wealth built on real estate empires and political connections. She was educated at private schools in Europe, spoke 3 languages, and moved through high society like she owned it. When Mark met her at a charity gala he'd been invited to as part of his legitimate business ventures, he was captivated, not just by her beauty, though she was stunning, but by the world she represented, a world he'd spent his entire life fighting to enter. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Linda was drawn to his power, his danger, the way people stepped aside when he walked into a room. Mark was drawn to her elegance, her family's connections, the way she made him feel like he was more than just a street thug who made good. They married in a ceremony that brought together senators, judges, and criminals in the same room, all smiling, all pretending. For 3 years, they were the ultimate power couple. Mark expanded his empire. Linda used her family's influence to smooth over legal troubles, open doors, legitimize his operations. From the outside, it was perfect. But Mark always had one question in the back of his mind, one doubt he could never quite silence. Does she love me, or does she love what I can give her? He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself that in his world, love was a weakness anyway. What mattered was loyalty. What mattered was the arrangement. But deep down, Mark Williams, the man who controlled everything, wanted to believe his wife saw him as more than just a source of power. Then came the night of the ambush. Mark had been meeting with the Moretti family, trying to negotiate territory disputes before things turned bloody. The meeting went well, too well. As Mark's SUV rolled through the warehouse district, he noticed the streets were too empty, too quiet. He just reached for his phone when the first shots rang out. 3 cars, automatic weapons, a coordinated hit designed to kill him and destabilize his entire organization. His bodyguard, Tony, a man who'd been with him for 12 years, threw himself over Mark as bullets shattered the windows. Tony took 5 rounds to the chest and back. He died before the shooting stopped. Mark survived, but his body was shattered. When he woke up in a private hospital wing his organization controlled, armed guards outside, doctors who'd been paid for their discretion, and Linda sitting in the corner of the room, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Mark," she whispered when she saw his eyes open. "Oh my God, Mark, you're awake." The doctor came in moments later, a man named Dr. Reeves, who'd been on Mark's payroll for years. He ran tests, asked questions, checked reflexes, and then he delivered the news with the kind of practiced sympathy that comes from giving bad diagnoses too many times. "Mr. Williams, I'm afraid the bullet damaged your spinal cord. You're paralyzed from the waist down. With physical therapy, there's a small chance of regaining some sensation, but the likelihood of you walking again is minimal." Mark didn't react. He just stared at the ceiling, processing. Linda gasped, covered her mouth, and then, to her credit, came to his bedside and took his hand. "We'll get through this together," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not going anywhere." But Mark saw something in her eyes that night, something she tried to hide but couldn't quite manage. It wasn't love. It wasn't even sympathy. It was fear. Fear of what his weakness meant for her. Fear of being trapped. Fear of the future she'd just inherited. The next day, Dr. Reeves came back for a private consultation. No Linda, no guards, just the 2 of them. "I need to tell you something," the doctor said quietly, glancing at the door. "The initial scans were premature. I ran more tests last night while you were sleeping. The damage to your spine is significant, but it's not permanent. With the right treatment, aggressive therapy, you could regain mobility in 3 to 4 weeks. You'll walk again, Mark." Mark felt relief flood through him, followed immediately by something else, a cold, calculating clarity. "Don't tell anyone," Mark said. Dr. Reeves blinked. "What?" "Don't tell Linda. Don't tell my men. Don't put it in any official records. As far as anyone knows, I'm paralyzed, permanently." "Mark, I don't understand." "I need to see who I can trust," Mark said, his voice hard. "Everyone thinks I'm finished. Everyone thinks I'm weak. I want to see what they do when they think I can't fight back, especially her." Dr. Reeves hesitated, then slowly nodded. "If that's what you want." "It is," Mark replied, "and you're the only person who knows the truth. Keep it that way." From that moment on, Mark Williams became a man in a wheelchair, weak, vulnerable, broken. But behind his tired eyes and slumped shoulders, he was watching everything. Every look, every whisper, every moment when people thought he couldn't see. And the first person he watched was his wife. At first, Linda played her part well. She stayed close, asked about his pain, rearranged her schedule to visit. But Mark noticed the small things. The way she wouldn't look directly at him anymore, the way he flinched when he reached for her hand, the way her phone buzzed constantly and she'd slip out of the room to answer it. Within a week, the cracks started to show. Linda stopped sleeping in his hospital room. Then she stopped visiting every day. Then she started going out. Dinners with friends, charity events, gallery openings. Always dressed beautifully, always smiling in the photos that showed up on social media. Mark said nothing. He just watched. And when he finally returned home to their estate, a sprawling mansion with armed guards, manicured gardens, and rooms filled with expensive art, he felt the coldness immediately. The house that had once felt like a symbol of everything he'd built now felt like a tomb. Linda was polite, distant. She made sure he had everything he needed, but she never stayed long. And when Mark tried to talk to her, really talk, about them, about the future, she'd find an excuse to leave. Then came the night everything changed. Mark was in his study, alone in his wheelchair, staring at financial reports he could barely focus on. Linda walked past the doorway, dressed for a night out. Black dress, heels, perfume. She didn't even glance in. "Linda," Mark called out. She stopped, turned slowly. "Yes? Where are you going?" "Out," she said simply. "Dinner with friends." "Stay with me tonight, please. I need you here." Linda's jaw tightened. She walked into the room, and for a moment, Mark thought she actually might stay. Then she spoke, and her voice was colder than he'd ever heard it. "I have a life, Mark. I can't just sit here and watch you feel sorry for yourself." Mark felt something crack inside him. "I'm your husband." "You were my husband," she said. The words slip out before she could stop them. She caught herself, but it was too late. "I mean, this isn't what I signed up for. I married a man who controlled this city, a man people feared. Not this." "Not what?" Mark asked, quietly, dangerously. "Say it." Linda looked at him, really looked at him, and Mark saw the truth written all over her face. "Not a man who can even stand up," she whispered. Silence, heavy, suffocating. Then Linda turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The front door slammed. Mark sat alone in his wheelchair, staring at the empty doorway. And in that moment, Mark Williams made a decision. He would give Linda all the rope she needed. He would stay silent. He would stay broken. And he would watch as she revealed exactly who she was. Because Mark had learned long ago, when you want to know who your real enemies are, you don't ask questions. You give them the chance to think they've already won. The game had begun, and Mark Williams was about to teach everyone around him the most important lesson they'd ever learn. Never, ever bet against a predator just because he's sitting down. Mark Williams didn't just run the city's underworld, he owned it. Every casino that glittered on the waterfront paid him tribute. Every construction project that broke ground had his silent approval. Every politician who smiled for cameras owed him favors they could never repay. He'd built an empire from nothing, and he wore that power like armor. But power, Mark had learned, was only as strong as the people who believed in it. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was supposed to be about love, not business. 3 years ago, he'd married Linda Hartford in a ceremony that made headlines, the dangerous street king and the society princess. Their anniversary dinner was at Marcello's, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, the kind of place where reservations required connections Mark had in abundance. Linda looked stunning across the candlelit table in an emerald dress that matched her eyes, but Mark noticed she'd barely touched her wine. Her smile was polite, practiced, the same smile she gave at charity galas when she was bored. "What's wrong?" Mark asked gently. "Nothing," Linda said, checking her phone for the third time. "Just tired." Mark reached across the table and took her hand. "I know things have been tense with the Moretti situation, but after tonight, I promise more time for us." Linda's expression softened slightly, though something flickered in her eyes that Mark couldn't quite read. "I'd like that." The drive home should have been peaceful. Mark's bodyguard, Tony, was driving the armored SUV through the warehouse district, the fastest route back to their estate. Mark was reviewing messages on his phone when Tony's voice cut through the silence. "Boss, something's not right." Mark looked up. The streets were empty. Too empty. No cars, no pedestrians, nothing. "Turn around," Mark said sharply. Tony yanked the wheel, but it was already too late. 3 black sedans screamed out from side streets, boxing them in. The night exploded with gunfire. Bullets hammered the SUV like hail. The bulletproof glass spiderwebbed but held. Tony accelerated, trying to ram through, when the rear windshield shattered. Mark heard Tony grunt, a terrible, wet sound, and then his bodyguard's body slumped forward. "Tony!" Mark shouted, reaching for him. That's when pain erupted in Mark's shoulder, hot, blinding. He looked down and saw blood spreading across his shirt. Another impact, this one in his lower back, and suddenly his legs felt wrong, distant, like they belonged to someone else. The SUV crashed into a lamppost. Mark's head slammed against the window. Through blurred vision, he saw masked men approaching, weapons raised. Then sirens, shouting, his own men arriving, returning fire. Someone pulled him from the wreckage. Mark tried to speak, tried to give orders, but darkness swallowed him whole. When he woke 2 days later in a private hospital room, Linda was there, her face pale and streaked with tears. Relief flooded her features when his eyes opened. "Mark, thank God, I thought I'd lost you." Dr. Reeves entered, his expression grave. He ran tests Mark barely registered, checking reflexes, asking questions. Then came the words that shattered everything. "Mr. Williams, the bullet damaged your spinal cord. You're paralyzed from the waist down." Linda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but Mark saw it. Just for a second before she caught herself, a flash of something that wasn't grief. It was panic, fear, not for him, for herself. Hours later, when Linda had gone home to rest and the guards stood outside, Dr. Reeves returned. He closed the door, his face conflicted. "Mark, I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "The paralysis, it's not permanent. With aggressive treatment, you'll regain mobility in 3 to 4 weeks. Mark felt relief wash over him, followed immediately by something colder. "Don't tell anyone." "What?" "I want to see who I can really trust. Everyone thinks I'm finished. Let them believe it." Dr. Reeves hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Especially not my wife," Mark added, his jaw tight. "I need to know if she loves me or just what I can give her." The doctor nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Mark stared at the ceiling long after Dr. Reeves left, his heart breaking with a truth he wasn't ready to face. The ambush hadn't just tried to kill him, it had revealed something far more painful, the question of whether the woman he loved would stay when he appeared broken. And deep down, Mark already knew the answer. Did you notice Linda's reaction when the doctor delivered the news? That split second of panic before she remembered to look devastated? If you caught that, drop a comment below, because that moment changes everything. Mark is about to discover the most painful truth of his life, and what happens next will break your heart before it gets better. Hit that like button if you're ready to see how far betrayal can go, and subscribe because this story is just getting started. Trust me, you won't want to miss what Mark does when he realizes his wife's true colors. Let's continue.
The mansion had never felt so cold. Mark's wheelchair rolled across the marble floors of his estate, and every echo seemed to mock him. This was the house he'd built with blood money and ambition. 15 bedrooms, a wine cellar that cost more than most people's homes, security systems that could rival a military compound. But now, returning here as a broken man, it felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Linda was waiting in the foyer when his men brought him inside, her face carefully composed into concern. "Welcome home," she said, and Mark noticed she stayed 3 steps back, as if his wheelchair carried some contagious disease. Over the next few days, Linda played her part beautifully when others were watching. When Mark's captains came to pay their respects, she stood behind his wheelchair with her hand on his shoulder, the picture of a devoted wife. When his attorney visited to discuss business continuity, she brought coffee and smiled gracefully before excusing herself. But Mark saw what others didn't. He saw how she wouldn't meet his eyes anymore, how her touch, when forced, felt mechanical, obligatory. He saw how she flinched almost imperceptibly when he reached for her hand at dinner, and he saw how she found reasons to be anywhere he wasn't. The breaking point came late one Thursday night. Mark had wheeled himself to the kitchen for water when he heard Linda's voice drifting from the study, sharp and desperate. He stopped in the hallway, hidden in shadow, and listened. "Oh, Mother, I can't do this anymore," Linda sobbed into her phone. "I didn't sign up for this. I married a powerful man, not an invalid who needs help getting dressed. This is destroying my life. Everyone looks at me with pity now. Pity." Mark's hands gripped the wheelchair armrest so tight his knuckles went white. "No, you don't understand," Linda continued, her voice breaking. "I feel trapped. Every time I look at him, all I see is what I've lost. The man I married doesn't exist anymore." Mark wheeled himself backwards silently, his heart fracturing with each word. He returned to his bedroom, jaw clenched, rage and heartbreak warring inside him. The next morning, Marco, his most trusted bodyguard, found him staring out the window. "Boss," Marco said carefully, "how are you holding up?" Mark turned to look at the man who'd been with him for 8 years, who'd taken bullets meant for others, who'd never once questioned his orders. "I need you to watch everyone, Marco, especially my wife." Marco's expression darkened with understanding. "I had a feeling. Report everything to me, Marco. Who visits, who calls, what she does when she thinks no one's paying attention. You got it." Later that afternoon, Vincent, Mark's underboss, arrived unannounced. He was all polished concern and business talk, but Mark noticed how his eyes lingered in the hallway where Linda had disappeared, how he asked too many questions about transition plans and contingencies. "Just want to make sure the organization stays strong while you recover," Vincent said smoothly. "Of course," Mark replied, playing the weakened boss perfectly. That night, Mark wheeled past the bathroom and heard Linda's voice, talking to herself, thinking she was alone. He stopped just outside the cracked door. Linda stood at the mirror, mascara-stained tears on her face. "How did I end up here?" Linda whispered to her reflection, her voice dripping with disgust. "Trapped with a cripple?" Mark sat frozen in his wheelchair, something inside him dying. This was the woman he'd loved, the woman he'd trusted with everything, the woman who saw him as nothing now that she thought he couldn't stand. He wheeled away silently, his decision made. He would give her enough rope. He would watch as she revealed her true self layer by layer, and when the time came, everyone would see exactly who Linda Williams Hartford really was, because Mark Williams had built an empire by being patient, by watching, by waiting for his enemies to expose themselves, and now his greatest enemy slept in his bed. Mark just heard his wife call him a cripple. The woman he'd have died for now can't stand to look at him. But here's what Linda doesn't know. Mark can walk. He's watching everything. And what he's about to discover about his wife and his underboss will make this betrayal look like mercy. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother once said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. If this story moved you, support the channel and help show that these stories matter. Hit that subscribe button because what Mark finds on those hidden cameras will shatter everything you think you know about loyalty and love. Comment below if you've ever trusted someone who destroyed you when you were at your lowest. Let's continue. The conference room had always been Mark's domain, the long mahogany table where he'd made decisions that shaped the entire city's underworld.
But wheeling himself to the head of that table now, Mark felt the shift in the air like a physical weight. His captains sat in their usual positions, but their eyes told a different story. Where there used to be respect, even fear, now there was uncertainty, doubt. Some looked at him with pity, others avoided looking at him at all. "Gentlemen," Mark began, his voice steady despite the performance he was giving, "I know the past few weeks have been difficult, but I want to assure you that this organization will continue to—" He let his hand tremble slightly as he reached for his water glass, deliberately fumbled it. The glass tipped, water spilling across the polished wood. Mark made a show of trying to reach for napkins, his movements awkward, helpless. The captains exchanged glances. Mark saw it all, the silent conversations happening without words. Can he still lead? Is he finished? What happens to us? Vincent rose smoothly from his seat. "Let me help you, boss." He mopped up the water with efficient movements, his voice dripping with false concern. "Maybe I should handle the day-to-day operations for a while, just until you're back on your feet." The bitter irony of that phrase hung in the air. Mark let silence stretch. Let them see him struggle with the decision. Let them think his pride was battling his limitations. Perhaps that would be best. For now. Vincent's smile was sympathetic, but Mark caught the flash of triumph in his eyes. "Whatever you need, boss, we're all here to support you." The meeting continued, but Mark was no longer leading it. Vincent was. And one by one, the captains began directing their questions, their reports, their deference to the underboss instead of their actual boss. Mark played his part perfectly, the broken king struggling to hold on to relevance. It was during a discussion about territory disputes that Linda entered, bringing coffee. She'd never done that before, never played the domestic wife during business meetings, but now she moved through the room with practiced grace, setting cups in front of each man. When she reached Vincent, their hands touched as she passed him his cup. It lasted a fraction too long. Their eyes met, held for just a moment, and Mark saw everything in that glance. Familiarity, understanding, something deeper brewing beneath the surface. Neither pulled away quickly enough. Linda moved on as if nothing had happened, but Mark's hands gripped his wheelchair beneath the table, rage coursing through his veins like poison. That night, after everyone had gone and Linda had retired to the guest bedroom she now occupied, Mark locked himself in the home gym on the estate's east wing, a room no one had reason to visit anymore. He gripped the parallel bars Dr. Reeves had secretly installed and pulled himself up. His legs shook, weak from disuse and injury, but they held. He took one step, then another. Pain shot through his spine, but Mark gritted his teeth and pushed through it. Every night after that he trained, rebuilding his strength in secret, preparing for the moment when he'd need it. During the day, Marco helped him install hidden cameras throughout the mansion, in the study, the living room, Linda's new bedroom, even the hallways. Tiny, undetectable, capturing everything. "Boss," Mark said one evening, his voice grim, "Linda's been making encrypted calls, multiple times a day, always when she thinks no one's around." "To who?" "Can't tell yet, but she's careful, too careful." Mark nodded slowly. "Keep monitoring. I want to know everyone she contacts, everywhere she goes." The proof came 3 days later. Mark was reviewing footage from the study when he saw it, Vincent arriving unannounced while Mark was supposedly resting upstairs, Linda greeting him at the door, the way Vincent's hand lingered on her lower back as they walked to the study, the way they stood too close during their business discussion. And then the moment that made Mark's blood run cold. Vincent's hand brushed Linda's again, this time deliberately. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled slightly toward his, the briefest touch that spoke of intimacy, of secret understanding. Mark watched from his wheelchair in the security room, his heart turning to ice. The woman he'd loved, the woman he'd built a life with, was betraying him with his own underboss. But Mark didn't move, didn't confront them, didn't reveal what he knew. Because a wounded predator doesn't strike until he knows exactly where to aim. And Mark was learning exactly where all his enemies were hiding. Did you catch that look between Linda and Vincent, that touch that lasted just a second too long? Mark saw it all, and he's not just watching anymore, he's recording everything. What he discovers next will reveal a conspiracy that goes deeper than just an affair. If this betrayal is making your blood boil, smash that like button. Drop a comment telling me what you'd do if you were Mark. Would you strike now or wait for more proof? And subscribe, because the next episode reveals the full extent of Linda and Vincent's plan. And trust me, it's so much worse than you think. The cameras are rolling, the secrets are spilling, and Mark Williams is about to see exactly how far betrayal can go. Let's continue.
Mark sat alone in the security room at 2 a.m., the glow of multiple monitors casting shadows across his face. He'd sent everyone away, told Marco he needed time alone to think. But thinking wasn't what he was doing. He was watching his marriage die in high definition. The footage was from 3 nights ago, Linda and Vincent in the study, standing close by the window. Mark's finger hovered over the fast-forward button, but something made him watch in real time, made him bear witness to every devastating second. Vincent's hand cupped Linda's face. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, and then they kissed. Not a brief moment of weakness, but something deep and familiar, something that spoke of practice, of repetition, of a relationship that had been growing while Mark bled in a hospital bed. When they finally pulled apart, Linda's voice was soft, intimate. "When this is over?" "When he's gone," Vincent finished, his hand trailing down her arm. "We'll have everything, the empire, the money, the respect, and we'll have each other." Linda looked up at him, and the tenderness in her expression made Mark's chest feel like it was caving in. She'd never looked at him like that, not even in the beginning. Mark's hands gripped the wheelchair armrest so hard the leather creaked. Every instinct screamed at him to storm downstairs, to confront them, to make them pay right now. But he forced himself to breathe, to think, to remember that rage without strategy was just weakness wearing a different mask. He had a plan. He just needed to be patient a little longer. The next morning, Mark wheeled himself to the breakfast table where Linda was picking at a yogurt parfait, scrolling through her phone. He smiled at her, the smile of a man who still believed in his wife's love. "Good morning, beautiful." Linda's head snapped up, and for just a second, Mark saw raw disgust flash across her face before she remembered to mask it. "Morning," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "I was thinking maybe we could have dinner together tonight. Just us, like we used to." Linda's jaw tightened. I have plans." "Cancel them," Mark said gently, reaching for her hand across the table. "Please, I miss you." Linda looked at his hand on hers like it was a snake. She pulled away slowly, deliberately. "Fine, dinner. I'll have the chef prepare something." That evening, she served him his meal with movements so stiff, so mechanical, that it was painful to watch. Her hands shook slightly as she set the plate down, not from nervousness, but from barely contained revulsion. "Thank you, sweetheart," Mark said, his voice warm. Linda's face twisted for just a moment, a flash of pure hatred that she quickly smoothed away. "You're welcome." Earlier that day, Mark had watched Vincent stride through the mansion like he already owned it, giving orders to Mark's soldiers, making decisions without consultation. The men obeyed, their loyalty already shifting to the man who could stand, who projected strength. Marco found Mark in his study that evening, his expression dark. "I know about Vincent and Linda," Mark said before Marco could speak. "I've seen everything." Marco's eyes widened, then hardened with anger. "Boss, I can take care of this right now."
No, Mark interrupted. There's more. They're planning something bigger than just an affair. I need to know what it is before we move. What do you need from me? Everything. Every meeting Vincent takes, every call Linda makes, every person they contact. They're building towards something, and I want to know what it is. That night, Mark reviewed more footage, and what he found shattered what was left of his heart. Linda in Vincent's arms in her bedroom, his lips against her neck, her voice breathless, desperate. I can't stand him touching me anymore. When will this nightmare end? Vincent's hands moved down her back. Soon, baby, very soon. He's weak. The organization's already turning. A few more weeks and we won't need him at all. Linda pulled back, her eyes meeting Vincent's. What are you saying? Vincent's smile was cold. I'm saying accidents happen to paralyzed men all the time. Tragic, unexpected, and completely believable. Linda should have looked shocked, should have pulled away, should have shown some shred of the woman Mark thought he'd married. Instead, she kissed Vincent again, harder this time, and whispered, "How long do I have to pretend to love him?" Mark stopped the footage, sat in the darkness of the security room, tears streaming down his face for the first time since the ambush. Not tears of sadness, tears of rage, of betrayal so profound it felt like his soul was being ripped apart. The woman he loved wanted him dead, was counting down the days until he'd disappear, and she had no idea that the man in the wheelchair was about to become the most dangerous threat she'd ever faced. Linda just asked how long she has to pretend to love her husband before he's gone. Not gone as in divorced, gone as in dead, and Vincent's planning it all. But here's what they don't know. Mark heard every word, saw every touch, and he's not paralyzed anymore. If your heart is breaking for Mark right now, hit that like button. Comment below and tell me, at what point would you have struck back? And subscribe because what Mark does next will redefine revenge. These two have no idea what's coming. The cameras are still recording. The conspiracy is deeper than anyone knows. And Mark Williams is about to show them all why you never plot against a king in his own castle. Let's continue.
Mark was reviewing financial alerts on his encrypted tablet when the notification came through. Someone had accessed his offshore accounts, not just viewed them, downloaded complete records. The access came from inside the mansion, from Linda's laptop. Mark's blood ran cold as he pulled up the activity logs. She'd been systematically copying everything: account numbers, business contacts, property deeds, shell company registrations, files that represented 30 years of carefully built criminal enterprise, now sitting on her personal computer. This wasn't a woman having an affair. This was a woman preparing to rob him blind. Marco entered the study, his face grim. "Boss, we've got a problem. Vincent was spotted meeting with the Morettis at their social club last night." Mark's head snapped up. "The Morettis? The family that tried to kill me?" "The same. I had one of our guys follow him. The meeting lasted 2 hours." Mark's mind raced, pieces clicking into place like a weapon being assembled. "Get me audio if they meet again. I need to know what they're discussing." The answer came 3 days later. Mark sat in the security room, listening to the bug Marco had planted in Vincent's car. Vincent was driving, Linda in the passenger seat, and their conversation made Mark's world tilt on its axis. "The Morettis are on board," Vincent said, his voice casual, confident. "They're willing to back my leadership transition in exchange for favorable territory arrangements." "Wait," Linda's voice cut in, sharp with realization. "The Morettis? They're the ones who—" "Vincent, did you set up the hit?" "Of course I did." Vincent said it like he was discussing the weather. Mark was never going to step aside. Men like him don't retire. They die in power or lose it. I just accelerated the timeline.
Mark's hands trembled. His own underboss, the man he'd mentored, promoted, trusted with his life. Vincent had orchestrated his murder. But he survived, Linda said, and Mark heard something in her voice, not horror at Vincent's confession, but concern about the complications it created. He survived, but he's broken, Vincent replied. Even better, actually. This way, we take over gradually. The captains are already looking to me for leadership. In a few weeks, Mark will be completely irrelevant. Then we handle the final transition. Final transition, Linda repeated softly. I mean an accident. Pills and alcohol, maybe. Or he falls down the stairs in his wheelchair. Tragic, but these things happen to disabled men. There was a pause. Then Linda's voice, small and cold. And after, what happens to me? Vincent's laugh was warm, intimate. Baby, you'll get your divorce settlement. Everything we've been copying from his accounts. Clean exit, clean conscience. You played the grieving widow perfectly, walked away with millions, and then, after a respectful period, you and I can finally be together publicly. I'll run the organization, you'll have your freedom and your money. Everyone wins. Except Mark, Linda said. Except the old man who never should have married a woman 30 years younger in the first place, Vincent corrected. He wanted a trophy wife. You wanted security and status. He got what he paid for. Not your fault he ended up paralyzed. Mark paused the recording, his entire body shaking with rage so pure it felt like lightning in his veins. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a complete conspiracy. Vincent had tried to kill him, failed, and now using Linda to finish the job. And Linda, the woman who'd promised to love him in sickness and health, was an active participant in his planned murder. The next recording destroyed what little was left of Mark's heart. It was audio from Linda's bedroom, captured 2 nights ago. Linda and Vincent's voices, intimate and satisfied. How much longer do I have to play the devoted wife? Every time he touches my hand, every time he looks at me with those pathetic, grateful eyes, I want to scream. Just a few more weeks, Vincent soothed. Keep accessing his files, keep playing your part, keep him trusting you. He asked me to have dinner with him last night, just the 2 of us, like old times. Linda's bitter laugh made Mark flinch. I had to sit there and pretend I didn't want to run from the room. You're doing beautifully, baby. Soon, this nightmare will be over. There was a pause, then Vincent's voice again, harder now, more calculating. The old man's time is done. This city needs a leader who can stand on his own 2 feet, someone strong, someone who isn't clinging to power from a wheelchair like some pathetic shadow of what he used to be. He still thinks I love him, Linda whispered, and Mark heard something in her voice that might have been guilt but was quickly buried under cruelty. He has no idea what's coming. Mark stopped the recording, sat in absolute silence as tears streamed down his face, not the tears of a broken man, but the tears of a predator who'd finally seen the full scope of the threat against him. They tried to kill him, failed, and now were planning to finish the job while robbing him of everything he'd built. But they made one critical mistake. They assumed the man in the wheelchair was helpless, and Mark Williams was about to teach them the most painful lesson of their lives. Vincent didn't just betray Mark, he orchestrated the hit that was supposed to kill him, and Linda isn't just having an affair, she's actively helping plan her husband's murder for money. They think they've won. They think Mark is helpless. They have no idea what's about to hit them. If you're as furious as I am right now, destroy that like button. Comment and tell me what punishment Vincent and Linda deserve, because Mark is about to deliver justice, and it won't be pretty. Subscribe now, because the next episode is when Mark finally stands up, and when he does, everyone's world is about to explode. The wheelchair was just camouflage, the weakness was just an act, and Mark Williams is about to remind everyone why you never, ever count out the most dangerous man in the room. Let's continue. Marco arrived at the mansion's East Wing gym at midnight, confused by Mark's cryptic message. The room had been locked for weeks. No one had reason to use it while the boss was confined to a wheelchair. But when Marco entered, Mark was standing by the parallel bars, his back to the door. "Boss?" Marco's voice cracked with shock. Mark turned slowly, and the look in his eyes made Marco's blood run cold. Not weakness, not vulnerability, but pure, calculated fury. "Close the door, Marco. Lock it." Marco did as instructed, his mind reeling. How long have you—" "3 weeks," Mark said, taking careful steps toward him. His gait was still cautious, rebuilding strength, but he was walking, fully, undeniably walking. "Dr. Reeves told me I'd recover. I chose not to tell anyone." Understanding dawned across Marco's weathered face. "You've been testing all of us." "Every single person in my organization," Mark confirmed, his voice hard as steel. "I wanted to see who would stay loyal when they thought I was finished, who would circle like vultures, who would betray me." He paused, his jaw tight. "You're one of 3 men who passed." Marco's eyes glistened. 8 years he'd served Mark, taken bullets, buried bodies, kept secrets, and in this moment, having his loyalty recognized after watching so many others turn, felt like vindication. "Whatever you need, boss, I'm with you. I need you to help me identify everyone else who's truly loyal. No assumptions. I want proof." Over the next week, they conducted careful counter-surveillance. Marco reached out to soldiers, asked subtle questions, observed behaviors. They tracked who Vincent met with, who took his calls, whose loyalty was shifting. The results were devastating. "Half the captains are hedging their bets," Marco reported, his voice disgusted. "They're not actively with Vincent, but they're positioning themselves to survive regardless of who comes out on top." Mark nodded grimly. "And the ones who are truly loyal?" "Tommy, the old soldier who's been with you since the beginning. He's been quietly pushing back against Vincent's orders, reminding the younger guys that you're still boss. And Sal, your accountant, he's been blocking Vincent's attempts to access certain accounts, making excuses about authorization protocols. 3 men, out of an organization of over 50 soldiers and 8 captains, only 3 had remained unquestionably loyal. Mark felt the weight of that betrayal settle into his bones, but he didn't have time for grief. He had work to do. He began systematically moving money from accounts Linda had accessed to new ones she didn't know existed, changed passwords, transferred property deeds, moved leverage, the kind of information that kept politicians and judges in his pocket to secure locations. Every asset Vincent and Linda thought they'd steal was disappearing like smoke. Tommy and Sal were brought into the inner circle. The 3 men met with Mark in the locked gym, their faces showing the same shock Marco had displayed when Mark stood from his wheelchair. "Gentlemen," Mark said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that could cut glass. "We're going to bring everyone together, one final family meeting, and we're going to expose every rat, every traitor, every coward who thought they could take what's mine." "When?" Tommy asked, his old eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Soon," Mark replied. "I want all the evidence compiled, every recording, every financial transfer, every secret meeting. When I reveal the truth, I want it to be undeniable." That night, Mark stood fully for the first time in front of Marco without the parallel bars, without support, just standing in the center of the gym, his legs strong, his spine healed, his body ready. Marco looked at him with something like awe. "I'm going to take back everything they tried to steal," Mark said, his voice low and lethal. "My organization, my money, my dignity, and they'll never see it coming." "What about Linda?" Marco asked carefully. Mark's expression went cold, empty. Linda made her choice. She chose greed over loyalty, Vincent over me, murder over marriage. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. She'll pay for that choice. They both will. Marco nodded slowly. What do you need me to do? Send out the meeting notice. Mandatory attendance for all captains and key soldiers. Tell them I'm making an announcement about the future of the organization. Vincent will think it's his coronation. Mark's smile was razor sharp. Let them think that. Let them all think I'm giving up, stepping aside, accepting my fate as a broken man. He walked to the window, looking out over the city he'd built his empire on. When I stand up in that room, Marco, everyone's world is going to shatter. I can't wait to see it, boss. Mark turned back to his most loyal soldier. Neither can I, because Mark Williams might have been tested, might have been shot, might have been betrayed by almost everyone around him, but he was never broken, and it's time everyone remembered why. Mark just revealed the truth to his 3 loyal soldiers. He can walk, he's been watching everything, and he's ready to strike. Vincent thinks he's taking over. Linda thinks she's getting away with murder and millions, but they have no idea the king is about to reclaim his throne. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother once said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. If this story moved you, support the channel and help show that these stories matter. Hit that subscribe button because the next episode is the confrontation we've all been waiting for. Mark calls the meeting, everyone shows up, and when he stands up from that wheelchair, the entire room is about to learn the most terrifying lesson of their lives. Comment below, what should Mark do to Vincent and Linda? Let's continue.
The announcement went out on a Wednesday morning. Mandatory family meeting. All captains and key soldiers required to attend. Mark's message was simple. He was making a final decision about the future of the organization and the transition of power. Vincent received the notification with barely concealed triumph. He immediately called Linda, his voice electric with excitement. This is it. He's giving up. He's finally accepting that he can't lead anymore. Linda's response was breathless with relief. So it's over? We're finally free? We're about to get everything we wanted, baby. Everything. What neither of them knew was that Marco, Tommy, and Sal had spent the previous 48 hours preparing the conference room like a battlefield. Hidden weapons positioned behind wall panels, loyal soldiers, the few who'd remained true, stationed in strategic positions disguised as regular security, and cameras recording every angle, every face, every moment of what was about to unfold. The morning of the meeting, Mark played his part to perfection. He could barely sit up when Linda came to help him dress, his movements weak and trembling. She performed the task with mechanical efficiency, her disgust poorly hidden. "Will you be there?" Mark asked softly, his voice deliberately fragile. "At the meeting. I'd like you beside me when I make the announcement." Linda's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile. "Of course, I'll be there." By 2 o'clock, the conference room was full. 8 captains sat around the long mahogany table, their faces a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. Soldiers lined the walls. Vincent sat at Mark's right hand, his posture relaxed, confident, like a prince waiting to be crowned. Linda stood behind Mark's wheelchair, her hand resting on his shoulder in a performance of wifely support that made Mark's skin crawl. Mark looked weaker than anyone had ever seen him. His suit hung loose on his frame. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheelchair armrests. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming. I know these past weeks have been difficult, uncertain. You've all been wondering about the future of this organization." Vincent leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming. Linda's fingers tightened on Mark's shoulder, anticipation radiating from her like heat. "I've made my decision," Mark continued, pausing as if gathering strength, "about who will lead, about how we move forward,
about the future of everything we've built. The room was silent, every person holding their breath. But first, Mark said, his voice suddenly clearer, stronger, we need to address some irregularities. Vincent's confident expression flickered, just for a second. Mark's hand moved beneath the table, pressing a button Marco had installed 3 days ago. The heavy oak doors slammed shut with a sound like thunder, electronic locks engaged with sharp clicks that echoed through the suddenly tense silence. Tommy and Sal moved from their positions by the walls, revealing the weapons they'd kept hidden. 4 more loyal soldiers stepped forward, blocking the exits. The captains, who'd been hedging their bets, went pale. Those who'd aligned with Vincent began to reach for weapons, then froze as Tommy's gun appeared, trained and steady. Nobody moves, nobody leaves, not until we settle some family business. Vincent shot to his feet, his face a mask of confusion, quickly morphing into calculation. Mark, what's going on? What is this? Linda's hand jerked away from Mark's shoulder like she'd been burned. Mark! Mark held up a hand for silence, and despite everything, despite his apparent weakness, the room obeyed. Because even broken, even betrayed, Mark Williams commanded respect that Vincent could never earn. For weeks, I've been watching who stayed loyal, watching who turned, watching who plotted against me in my own house, in my own organization, in my own bed. Vincent's face went white. Linda took a step back from the wheelchair, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror. And what I've discovered, Mark continued, his eyes moving slowly around the room, landing on each face with the weight of judgment, is that betrayal runs deeper than I ever imagined. So before we talk about the future, before we discuss transitions of power, before anyone leaves this room, we're going to watch some videos. Marco stepped forward with a tablet, connecting it to the large screen on the wall. And then, Mark said, his voice dropping to something cold and lethal, we're going to have a conversation about loyalty, about consequences, and about what happens when you bet against a king while he's still breathing. Vincent's hand moved toward his jacket, toward the gun Mark knew he carried. I wouldn't, Tommy said quietly, his weapon never wavering. The room held its breath, balanced on a knife's edge between order and chaos, and Mark Williams sat in his wheelchair, watching his enemies realize, too late, that they'd walked straight into a trap. The doors are locked, the guns are drawn. Everyone who betrayed Mark is trapped in that room with him, and they're about to see footage of everything, the affair, the conspiracy, the murder plot. But here's what nobody knows yet. Mark can walk, and when he stands up, it's going to change everything. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother once said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. If this story moved you, support the channel and help show that these stories matter. Smash that subscribe button because the next episode is the moment we've all been waiting for, the reckoning. Vincent and Linda are about to face justice, and Mark Williams is about to stand up and take back his throne. Comment below, what should happen to traitors? Let's continue. The screen flickered to life, and the conference room filled with the image of Vincent and Linda in the study, their bodies pressed together, kissing with an intimacy that made several captains shift uncomfortably in their seats. When this is over, Linda's voice echoed through the speakers. When he's gone, Mark watched Vincent's face drain of color, watched Linda's hand fly to her mouth in horror, but he didn't stop the footage. He let it play. Every kiss, every touch, every whispered promise they'd made while he sat broken in his wheelchair. The video changed. Now it was audio recordings, Vincent's voice crystal clear. The Morettis are on board. Set up the hit? Of course I did. Gasps rippled through the room. Captains who'd been loyal to Vincent suddenly looked at him like he was a stranger, a monster they'd never truly known. Mark was never going to step aside. Vincent's recorded voice continued. Men like him don't retire. They die in power or lose it. The screen shifted again, displaying financial records, Linda's laptop accessing Mark's offshore accounts, copying files, transferring information. Timestamps showed she'd been doing it for weeks, methodically stealing every piece of leverage Mark had built over 30 years. Vincent's face had gone from white to gray, sweat beading on his forehead. Linda stood frozen behind Mark's wheelchair, tears streaming down her face, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. "Mark," Vincent said, his voice shaking as he tried to regain control. "Brother, let me explain. This isn't, I'm not your brother," Mark interrupted, his voice like ice cracking under pressure. "And you're not family. Family doesn't orchestrate murder. Family doesn't conspire with enemies. Family doesn't betray the man who gave them everything." Vincent's hand moved toward his jacket, a desperate man reaching for the only power he had left: violence. But Tommy was faster. He and Sal moved simultaneously, restraining Vincent, slamming him face first against the conference table. Vincent struggled, cursing, but loyal soldiers pinned his arms, stripped his weapon. "Mark, please." Linda's voice broke through the chaos, high and desperate. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do. You were hurt, and Vincent said you were finished, and I couldn't." "You couldn't stand being married to a cripple," Mark said quietly, and the room went silent. "Isn't that what you told your mother? What you told your reflection when you thought no one was listening?" Linda sobbed, her perfect facade completely shattered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant." "You meant every word, every touch you pulled away from, every look of disgust, every night you spent in his arms planning my death." The final recording played, Linda's voice, breathy and intimate. "I can't stand him touching me anymore. When will this nightmare end?" And Vincent's response, "The old man's time is done. This city needs a leader who can stand on his own 2 feet." The words hung in the air, heavy with cruel irony. Because that's when Mark stood up. Not slowly, not with struggle or pain, but with the fluid, controlled movement of a man who'd been secretly training for weeks, rebuilding his strength, waiting for this exact moment. The wheelchair rolled backward, abandoned. Mark Williams stood tall, his full height imposing, commanding, terrifying in its implication of everything they'd gotten wrong. The room erupted in shocked gasps, chairs scraping back, weapons clattering. Vincent's eyes went wide with absolute horror. Linda's legs gave out and she collapsed to her knees, her mouth open in a soundless scream. Even the captains who'd remained loyal looked stunned, realizing they'd been part of a test they didn't know they were taking. Mark took one step, then another, walking across the room with steady, deliberate strides toward where Vincent was pinned against the table, his face pressed into the wood, his eyes wild with terror and disbelief. Mark leaned down, his face inches from Vincent, his voice soft and deadly. "You made one mistake," Mark said, each word sharp enough to cut. "You assumed a wounded predator is a dead one. You thought the wheelchair made me weak. You thought paralysis meant powerless." He straightened, looking down at the man who tried to steal everything. "But I was never broken, Vincent. I was just watching, waiting, learning exactly who my enemies were, and you showed me everything I needed to know." Vincent's voice came out strangled, desperate. "You can't. The organization won't." "The organization belongs to me," Mark said, his voice rising now, addressing the entire room. "It always has, and every man here knows it. The question is, who stays loyal to the rightful king, and who burns with the traitors?" Absolute silence. The kind of silence that precedes either surrender or war. And in that silence, Mark Williams reclaimed his throne. Mark just stood up and walked across that room, and Vincent's entire world shattered in one moment. But the reckoning isn't over. Now comes the punishment. What happens to a man who orchestrated his boss's murder? What happens to a wife who chose greed over love? If your heart is racing right now, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what justice looks like. Should Mark show mercy or deliver the full weight of his power? And subscribe because the final episode reveals Linda's choice, Vincent's fate, and how Mark rebuilds his empire from the ashes of betrayal. The king is standing, the traitors are trapped, and what happens next will define everything. Let's continue. Mark stood at the head of the conference table, no longer the broken man in a wheelchair, but the king who'd built this empire from blood and ambition.
His eyes swept across the room, cataloging every face, every expression of shock and fear. "Let's talk about loyalty," Mark said, his voice calm, but
Gentlemen, the
carrying
time
the
has come
weight
to
of
make our
absolute
move.
authority.
We must act
Some of
decisively and
you
without
stayed true.
hesitation.
Some of you hedged your bets. Some of you actively conspired against me, and every single one of you is going to face consequences for your choices. He pointed to Vincent, still pinned against the table, his face twisted with rage and terror. "Take him to the basement. You all know what happens there." Vincent began to struggle, to scream, "Mark, no! Please, I can explain. I can make this right." But Marco and Tommy dragged him toward the door, his protests dissolving into desperate pleas that fell on deaf ears. The sound of his voice faded as he disappeared down the hallway, and everyone in the room knew they'd never see Vincent Russo alive again. Mark turned to the captains, his gaze landing on each man who'd wavered. "Those of you who didn't actively betray me but didn't stay loyal either, you're demoted. You'll work your way back up or you'll prove you don't belong here at all. Probation starts now." 4 captains nodded, shame written across their faces. "And those who helped Vincent?" Mark's voice dropped to something lethal. "You have 2 choices. Leave the city tonight and never come back, or join Vincent in the basement. Decide now." 2 men stood immediately, terror driving them toward the door. They fled without looking back, their careers and reputations destroyed in an instant. Then Mark's eyes found Linda, still on her knees where she'd collapsed when he stood up. Mascara streaked her face. Her perfect composure had crumbled into something raw and broken. "Get up," Mark said quietly. Linda struggled to her feet, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. "You have a choice to make," Mark continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "Option 1, I turn you over to the authorities. You testify against yourself, provide evidence of conspiracy to commit murder, theft, and everything else you've done. Federal prison, probably 20 years if you're lucky." Linda's sob caught in her throat. "Option 2, you leave, right now, with nothing but a single suitcase. You never come back to the city, you never contact me or anyone in this organization again. There will be a restraining order. If you violate it, option 1 becomes automatic. Choose." The room was silent except for Linda's ragged breathing. "I'll leave. I'll go. Just please." "Go pack. You have 1 hour." Linda fled from the room, her heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. Marco followed to ensure she took only what Mark had specified: 1 suitcase, no jewelry, no cash, nothing of value. 53 minutes later, Linda appeared in the foyer, a single black suitcase in her hand, her face puffy and red from crying. She looked like a ghost of the elegant woman who'd once commanded every room she entered. Mark stood at the top of the stairs, watching her with cold, empty eyes. Linda walked to the door, then paused, turned back to look up at him one final time. "Did you ever really love me?" she asked, her voice broken and small. Mark's jaw tightened. For a moment, he looked like he might not answer. Then, "Yes, I did." The pain in those 3 words was devastating in its honesty. "Did you ever love me?" Mark asked back, his voice barely above a whisper. Linda opened her mouth, closed it. Tears streamed down her face, but no words came, because they both knew the truth. She'd loved his power, his money, his status, but she'd never loved the man. Her silence was the answer. She turned and walked out the door, out of the mansion, out of his life. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything. Mark stood there for a long time, staring at the empty foyer, feeling the weight of her betrayal settle into his bones one final time. Then he turned and walked back to his office. There was an empire to rebuild, and broken hearts didn't bring back lost time.
but standing there alone, Mark Williams finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd lost. Not just a wife, but the dream that someone could love him for who he was, rather than what he could provide. The king had reclaimed his throne, but he would rule it alone. Linda couldn't even say she loved him. After everything, the marriage, the vows, the years together, she couldn't give him that one truth. She walked out with nothing, and Mark let her go. But the story isn't over yet. There's one final chapter that shows what Mark becomes after betrayal, and whether a man built on violence can ever find peace. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother once said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. If this story moved you, support the channel and help show that these stories matter. Hit subscribe button to find out what Mark did. 6 months later, Mark's empire is stronger than ever. But is he? What happens to a king who won the war but lost his heart? Comment and tell me, can Mark ever trust again? Let's finish this story together.
6 months had passed since the reckoning, and Mark Williams' empire had never been stronger. The organization was leaner now, 50 soldiers reduced to 30, 8 captains down to 5, but every man who remained had proven their loyalty when it mattered most. There were no more questions about who led, no more whispers in dark corners about transitions of power. Mark had reclaimed his throne, and he ruled it with the iron certainty of a man who'd seen betrayal's ugliest face and survived. Marco sat across from him in the study, wearing the title of underboss with quiet pride. "The Moretti family wants to negotiate," he reported. "After what happened to Vincent, they've been scrambling to distance themselves from the whole situation." Mark smiled coldly. "Let them scramble. They backed the wrong horse. They'll come to us on our terms, or not at all." "Already sent the message, boss." Mark stood, the movement natural now, effortless, the wheelchair long since retired to storage like a dark memory he no longer needed to carry. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city lights twinkling in the darkness. His city, his empire, built with blood and maintained with iron discipline. Mark Williams had everything a man of his world could want: power, wealth, respect, absolute control. He'd survived an assassination attempt, exposed a conspiracy, eliminated his enemies, and emerged stronger than before. But as he stood there, alone in the vast emptiness of his victory, Mark understood the price of that strength. He would never love carelessly again, never trust easily, never allow himself to be vulnerable in the way he'd been with Linda. The wheelchair was temporary, but the lessons it taught him would last forever. "I learned the hardest lesson," Mark whispered to his reflection in the window. "In this life, loyalty is rarer than love and far more valuable, and I'll never forget the difference again." He stood there as night deepened around him, no longer broken, never to be vulnerable again. The king alone on his throne, powerful and solitary exactly as he'd chosen to be. Because Mark Williams discovered that surviving betrayal meant becoming someone who could never be betrayed the same way twice. And that man, standing at the window overlooking his empire, would rule forever, strong, vigilant, and utterly, devastatingly alone. Mark won. He survived, he conquered, he reclaimed everything. But look at him standing there, alone, powerful but empty, a king without a kingdom of love. He learned that loyalty matters more than love, but at what cost? He'll never be vulnerable again, never trust completely, never love freely. Is that victory or just another kind of prison? If this story broke your heart and made you think about trust, loyalty, and the price of power, hit that like button. Comment below and tell me, did Mark make the right choice? Could he have handled this differently? And subscribe because I have more stories like this, stories about people tested by betrayal, surviving impossible situations, and learning brutal truths about human nature. Thank you for staying with Mark's journey, from the ambush to the reckoning to this moment of hollow victory.
Share this with someone who needs to hear it, who's been betrayed, who's learning that strength sometimes comes from the darkest places. Until the next story, remember, people show you who they really are when they think you can't fight back. Never forget that lesson. Take care of yourselves.